I am Dr. Megan Clark. I am the faculty co-chair of the St. John's CRS Global Campus Committee. And one of the things that we do is that we have a series of virtual webinars throughout the year focused on matters of global justice broadly understood. And it is my distinct pleasure today to welcome you all to the first of these for this academic year, and to turn it over to Dr. Fred Cocozzelli, who's also a committee member and chair of the Department of Government and Politics.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, thank you all for coming, as Dr. Clark said, for those of you out there. And like I said, my name is Fred Cocozzelli. I'm the chair of the Department of Government and Politics. I'm very pleased to be moderating this because I do think this is, it's been such a persistent conflict, but one that the United States and so many students may not really see or have the background. But, one of the speakers, Anna here, I remember this as a graduate student when we were in graduate school in 99 and 2000 as being something that was pressing even then. And so the persistence of this particular conflict, I think, is something students really need to hear about. So allow me to introduce our speakers, though. Anna Hess Sargsyan, did I get that right? Is the head of conflict resolution at the Austrian Center for Peace and International Affairs professional with extensive experience in peace and conflict studies and mediation. Anna has designed and supported a number of formal and informal peace processes, developed and led educational programs in the field of peace and conflict studies. She is the head of conflict resolution and is responsible for leading the team at the Austrian Center for Peace in their work in dialogue and mediation across the Middle East, Africa, and Eurasia. Welcome, Anna. Next, we have Artyom Tonoyan. Did I get that right?
Artyom
Tonoyan is a visiting professor of global studies at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Formerly a research associate at the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the editor of the recently published Black Garden Aflame, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in the Soviet and Russian press. Frequent commentator on Armenian, Azerbaijani, and Armenian Turkish issues, and provides commentary and analysis for global press. Welcome. And finally, we have Professor Mark Movsesian, the Frederick A. Whitney Professor of Contract Law right here at St. John's, and the co-director of the Center for Law and Religion. He writes on law and religion, contracts, international and comparative law, visiting professor at Notre Dame and Cardozo Law Schools. He's delivered papers across the United States and Europe, and teaches not only contracts at the law school, but comparative law and religion. So welcome to all of you. And I believe we're going to start with some opening questions, is the format, right? So I think as I've got to explain with Artyom, if you can give us a little bit about the history and the context of the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh, why it's contested, and sort of a little bit about where it is sort of in the global history or the regional history, and then sort of more globally.
So thank you, Fred, and thank you, Megan, for organizing this panel. And I think it cannot be any more timelier than it is, because the developments are still fresh and the developments are fluid, and this can go in any number of ways. But again, thank you for inviting me and my co-panelists to talk about this. So a brief background on the conflict. This is one of those conflicts that sort of emerged in late 1980s in the former Soviet countries, in the former Soviet Union, and in a sense accelerated the demise and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it also has a historical context that needs to be discussed a little bit, so as to give the students and the faculty some idea about the conflict's past and some idea about where it's headed now. We're not going to talk about the long term or the long history of the conflict, but rather the medium and short-term history of the conflict, because if we go all the way into the ancient history path, we may end up with Cain and Abel and tortoises all the way down. But the modern roots of the conflict is safe to say that emerges early 1900s. In 1905, 1907, there were Armeno-Tatar wars, as they were known. Azerbaijanis at the time were referred as Caucasian Tatars, sometimes Azerbaijani Turks. But there were clashes and mutual massacres in 1905, between 1905 and 1907. And in the midst of these clashes, nationalist various parties arise, which hardens the positions of the parties. Then the Tsarist government collapses during World War I. Soon thereafter, Armenia and Azerbaijan also fight a brief war over the region in late 1918, and then the region is becomes part of the Soviet Union in 1921. And in 1921, Azerbaijan, Sovietized Azerbaijan, decides that the region can be transferred under Armenian sovereignty, because the population of Nagorno-Karabakh was by and large Armenian, about 90% of the population. But within days of Azerbaijan's government's decision to give Nagorno-Karabakh to the Soviet Armenian Republic, Stalin reverses the decision of the Azerbaijani government, and Stalin, being the leader of the commissar of the nationalities in the newly established Soviet Union, no one could really actually disagree with Stalin without any consequences. So the transfer of the region doesn't occur, neither de jure nor de facto. And what we have is a new emergent Soviet political order in 1920s, which then solidifies the existing political boundaries and social boundaries and demographic boundaries in the Soviet Union, and the conflict essentially becomes frozen until 1960s, when Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh start petitioning the Soviet government to take another look at the arrangement of the 1920s and transfer the region back to Armenia. Well, the Soviet government ignores. Fast forward 20 more odd years. In 1987, a new nationalist environmental movement starts in Armenia, and then it transmogrifies into demands, first within Nagorno-Karabakh, then in Armenia proper, to again relitigate the injustice as Armenians perceived of the 1920s. But by 1980s, there have been several changes that have taken place on ground. Armenians are, through social and demographic engineering by the Soviet Azerbaijani government, Armenian demographics are in decline. As you remember, I said at the beginning of the incorporation of Nagorno-Karabakh into Soviet Azerbaijan, the population was about 90% Armenian. But by 1988, the Armenian population is only 75%, which means 15% decline among the Armenian population and a corresponding 15% increase for the Azerbaijani population. And alongside this demographic crisis, as the Armenians saw it, there were several grievances that had persisted. Cultural grievances. Armenians could not essentially learn in Armenian educational system, or the educational system in Azerbaijan would not allow a fully Armenian school curricula, where Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh would learn their history and Armenian history and keep their language. And there were also economic grievances. The economy was depressed in the region. Not that the economy in the Soviet Union at the time was anywhere prosperous, but the Armenians compared their living standards not to Azerbaijan in which they sort of existed, but to neighboring Armenia. And Armenian economy was faring much better than Azerbaijan, despite Azerbaijan's sort of larger economic footprint in the overall Soviet Union. So what happens? Armenians in 1980s start peaceful demonstrations and a nonviolent movement to demand the transfer of Nagorno-Karabakh back to Armenia. But Azerbaijan, in a sense, lashes out, or certain segments within the Azerbaijani population lash out. And in 1988, February 27, there are pogroms of Armenians in a town called Sumgait. If you look at the map, it's just northwest of Baku. It is essentially a suburb of Baku. Sumgait was not known for anything in particular or anything spectacular, only to end up doing something spectacularly bad in 1988, which was the massacres of the Armenians. And then the logic of violence from then on takes its own course. There are further massacres of Armenians in 1989 in a town of Kirovabad, which is now known as the town of Ganja. And the culmination of the anti-Armenian policies and pogroms is in 1990, January 12th through the 14th, when Armenians in Baku, Azerbaijan's capital, are killed and massacred and driven out. And what follows is violent expulsion of Azerbaijanis from Armenia as well. And then the Soviet Union collapses, and what you have, what was initially an intrastate conflict that was happening within the boundaries of the Soviet Union. In 1991, Armenia and Azerbaijan become independent states, and the conflict then transforms into an international conflict, where now you have international actors getting involved: the US, France, Russia, the EU, and so on and so forth. Armenians managed to win the war and take over large swaths of territory, which also means that Azerbaijanis were driven out of their houses, or they didn't feel safe to remain behind. And Armenia takes over almost the entirety of Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 surrounding regions, creating a refugee crisis. About 500,000 Azerbaijanis had to leave and flee their homes, and Armenians from Azerbaijan proper, around 300, 400,000 Armenians, 300,000 probably is more correct number, are driven out of Azerbaijan. So what you have is a population exchange, but Armenians come on top militarily. In 1994, in Kyrgyzstan's capital, Bishkek, ceasefire is signed, brokered by Russia and aided by the EU and the United States friends. And the ceasefire held until 2016, when Azerbaijan launched a brief 4-day war and retook a sliver of land from Nagorno-Karabakh and one village, as far as I remember. But in 2016, everybody understood that the conflict was going to become larger and more decisive. And it became so in the fall of 2020, when Azerbaijan, aided by Turkey, a NATO ally, and aided by Pakistan, and aided by weapons supplied by Israel, and aided by jihadis brought into the theater from Syria by the Turkish intelligence services, attacked Nagorno-Karabakh, were able to take over about 75% of what they had lost in 1990s. And another ceasefire was broken by Vladimir Putin in November 9 of 2020. And the ceasefire held, but the condition of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh wasn't becoming any better. Fast forward 2 more years, and in December of 2021 or 2022, Azerbaijan imposes a total blockade on Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. And following a 10-month siege that had created unlivable conditions in Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan launches yet another military campaign against Nagorno-Karabakh, driving out the remaining Armenians from the region, upwards of 100,000 civilians, and effectively creating new facts on the ground where Nagorno-Karabakh no longer has any Armenians, and and the Armenian churches and Armenian cultural heritage is in a very precarious situation. And everyone that knows the situation on the ground, and I consider myself among them, think that the Armenian cultural heritage, for all intents and purposes, either will be destroyed because there has been precedent, or transformed into something else to serve the ruling party and the ruling regime for its political purposes. And we can talk about in the Q&A in a more broader way.
Hey, we will come to the Q&A. Thank you very much for the historical context there. Very useful and an excellent sort of segue into, Anna, the work you're currently doing. And if you can sort of give us a sense of the reality on the ground now, as Artyom pointed out, the last year has been quite decisive. Last 10 months, right, from December to now. And if you could give us some insight into what's going on in terms of peace and conflict in the region now, and as well the humanitarian dimension of this, the crisis, the displacement, and the responses that are either available in place or also not forthcoming, right? The response that maybe is not as vibrant as it should be.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Fred and colleagues, for the invitation. A round of thanks from my side. It's a great pleasure to be with you all, and what I'm assuming a vibrant group of students. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A. But before, and thank you for bringing the attention, as Artyom said, on Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia-Azerbaijan issue. In this day and age, it's not happening that often. So all the more happy to be here. A word of clarification: I don't actually professionally work in this context, right, for our audience to know, but I do visit quite regularly Armenia. I used to visit in the past 3 years to Nagorno-Karabakh as well. So my insights are going to be sort of personal mixed with professional observations. All right, where do we stand after all of this that Artyom told us? I mean, it's basically what Fred, you said, the conflict has been considered one of the protracted conflicts in the post-Soviet space. And, it has been going on for 30 years, immune to negotiations, and eventually, or mediation, and eventually we had the military force taking over in a context internationally, regionally, where might has become right, and multilateralism or multilateral diplomacy is going down the drain, at least the one embedded in the values that we believe in, right? So, I mean, for us to understand the context on the ground, it's important to sort of locate in the regional, but also in the international context what's happening, where use of force has become, the daily norm, and use of force or resolution of conflicts through use of force has become the norm, as we know. Now, what's happening on the ground? I mean, the 30 years, we don't have to go back to, as you said, Artyom, to Adam and Eve, but so I'd like to talk about 3 years, right? So we had the 30 years of failed negotiations. We had a de facto republic that was unrecognized, the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, that was unrecognized by anybody, including Armenia, but it existed, right, with all the symbolics, but beyond symbolics, with all the processes that a state needs, and the identity markers that a state has. So it was there, it existed. And then we had the past 3 years, post-2020, 44-day war that Azerbaijan launched against Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, essentially, to settle the issue with the military force, with the use of force. So in the past 3 years, you have 3 Septembers that are kind of key, in trying to understand what happened. September 2020, as Artyom said, Azerbaijan takes control not only of NK surrounding territories, but also a bit more. I will come to that. September 2021, Azerbaijan launches offensive or incursions into Armenia proper, changing the reality essentially on the ground even further. And then September 2023, Am I mixing up the years? Yes. So forgive me, September 2022, and then September 2023 is the offensive, the full-blown offensive against Nagorno-Karabakh, which essentially settles the issue for Azerbaijan, militarily. So where do we stand, right? After these 3 September offensives against Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, we have lost 5,000 casualties in the September 2020 war. It has left Armenian army in shambles. We have more than 10,000 injured, soldiers. You have displacement, massive displacement. 100,000 people we're talking about from Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia. You have to look at the humanitarian aspect. You have to look at then what these 3 offensives left Armenia politically, like where it left Armenia politically, the impact, humanitarian impact, political impact, and then the security and also socio-economic and cultural and or psychosocial, right? So all of these aspects need to be unpacked. I think we don't have the time for that, but I will quickly go into the political impact. Basically, within Armenia, you have a massive polarization. So the war and the NK debacle or loss of NK for Armenia has left Armenia massively polarized, and the polarization usually goes along 2 cleavages, right? One is who bears responsibility for this disaster, for the catastrophe, and the other one has to do with the foreign and security policy orientation of Armenia. So we can go into details if anyone is interested, but essentially you have a highly polarized political context within Armenia. You have a highly unstable regional context security-wise, and we had that map, and I think our students would see where Armenia is located together with Nagorno-Karabakh. So you have really volatile region right now. And then socioeconomically, it's a massive strain, obviously, for Armenia because trying to incorporate 100,000 people in or integrate or accommodate 100,000 people who have lost their homes on their ancestral lands, giving them economic opportunities, shelter, housing, social care. That's a massive strain on already strained Armenian economy. We're talking about a low to mid-income country, I think. Psychosocially, it has to be, highlighted. It is a society that is massively traumatized now because we're talking about recurrent traumas, right? As was mentioned by Artyom, this goes back to Adam and Eve, the history. So you have really recurrent traumas that the society has to deal with. It has left part of the society is sort of paralyzed and traumatized, and the other part is sort of, pulling itself together and trying to focus on the humanitarian issues mostly. So what's happening, I would like to focus quickly on the security front, right? I mean, we talked about the three September offensives and what we call the salami tactics that Azerbaijan has been using, to actually to push ahead with its assertive and revisionist policy vis-a-vis Armenia and vis-a-vis Nagorno-Karabakh, right? And I'm saying revisionist because it's an extremely important element of the Azeri policy today towards Armenia. So we have Armenia essentially has outsourced its security to Russia. That has been its traditional ally, but Russia has been, carrying out different policy now in the region and towards Armenia. We can come to this as well, but it's important for our audience to understand that basically the alliances are shifting in the region and they are not stable or static as they used to be. So having outsourced its security to Russia, Armenia is essentially now in a very uncomfortable position because Russia has turned out to be the unreliable partner for the Armenian authorities, at least, right? So you have full energy dependency on Russia. You have full security dependency on Russia, but Russia hasn't actually lived up to its commitments, security commitments vis-a-vis Armenia. Now, that's opening a Pandora's box. I don't want to go in there, but I think it's important to understand this. So what that leaves Armenia with, remember I mentioned about the polarization when it comes to foreign and security policy orientation. Right now, what is happening is the Armenian government, actually desperate for reliable allies, is searching left and right, and it's moving from pro-Russian to pro-Western orientation, it can change within a day. I don't want to be cynical, but so it's in a flux. But that leaves the country very, very insecure, unstable, because essentially when it comes to security alliances, you have to see who has boots on the ground, who has the capability, and who has the right intentions, right, to come to, not your rescue, but to your, to providing your security. So one last word on the current situation, and then I will pass the screen. In terms of the alliances and in terms of the insecurity, I think what is important for the audience to understand, to locate the situation, the contextual, the regional context, right? What's happening, the shifting alliances, Armenians increasing insecurity vis-a-vis, and most important, what I want to highlight is the aggressive and assertive Azeri policies and narratives, right? Because essentially for Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh issue is settled, right? They see this as settled through military force. And now they have transported the conflict from Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia proper. So the geography of the conflict has changed. It has been moved to Armenia and Azerbaijan. And what I mentioned between Armenia and Azerbaijan, because essentially Azerbaijan has territorial claims towards Armenia proper. So a country that for 30 years was talking about its restoring its territorial integrity now has serious claims over Armenia's territorial integrity, right? So that's extremely important to keep in mind. So that this is where the geography of the conflict is right now between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And as we speak, we're not finished, right? It's not done because every day or in the coming weeks, there is always expectation or anticipation, at least from those from the analysts community, but also policymakers, that Azerbaijan will launch another offensive, and this time it's going to be against Armenia proper. So that's the situation we're dealing with. I think I should stop here and then pass the screen to Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to save for questions, but I've got all sorts of questions for you when we come around to it. So, but we can move to Mark. And if we could sort of open it now up to international law questions. A lot of the news and the social media has been about international law, laws of armed conflict. In this particular context, Mark, where's the international law application, right? I mean, I think there's some not obvious but fairly clear ones, but how are they going to be enforced? Who's going to be pressing these claims, and what kind of venue would they press them in?
Well, thank you, Fred. Thank you, and to Megan, and also to Alec Gavorkian, who helped put this together. I want to thank him too, and thank you to all the listeners for coming. Your question is about international law and what effect it's going to have, how it's going to play out here. And I have to say, I fear for those who are listening, I'm not going to have a terribly hopeful discussion about this. I used to teach international law, and one reason I don't teach international law so much anymore is it's a kind of frustrating thing. So for people who don't understand, international law, we can't get into too much detail, but public international law is the law that, broadly speaking, governs the relations among nation states. And this is something the international law has developed over time, especially in the 20th century. It places restrictions upon states in their dealings with others. For example, there's a principle of non-aggression. It also places duties upon states with respect to their own populations in certain circumstances. Much of international human rights law is about all that, and much of it is motivated by very good things and aspires to very good things. But unlike domestic law, there is not a clear, effective, I should say, not an effective enforcement mechanism for most of these things. And so I think what the Karabakh crisis has shown us, if we didn't know already, is that international law matters when great powers think that it matters for them. International law matters when great powers think it's in their interests for international law to matter, and when it doesn't matter, when great powers don't think it's in their interest, especially. So I don't want to take too much time and belabor this. There could be a lot of examples given, but I'll just give you one. So there is an international convention called, for shorthand, the International Anti-Racism Convention. The longer name is the Convention on the Eliminations of All Form of Race Discrimination, to which many states have signed on, including Azerbaijan and Armenia. And during the crisis, the most recent Karabakh crisis, Armenia claimed that the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh, which started last year, and I think your listeners, I think the audience probably knows about this. This is not one of the things that's been said so far that much. But about a year ago, Azerbaijan cut off the Lachin corridor. We can't see the map anymore, but there's only one way out of Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia. Azerbaijan stopped that and blockaded the region for 9 months. And towards the end, in fact, was not letting anything in. I mean, no humanitarian assistance of any kind. Armenia alleged that this treatment of Nagorno-Karabakh violated Azerbaijan's duties under the International Anti-Racism Convention. And where do you go if you claim there's a violation? Well, Armenia went to the International Court of Justice in the Netherlands, also sometimes called the World Court, and sued there, and Azerbaijan appeared, and the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of Armenia, ruled that what Azerbaijan was doing violated the international commitments it had made, or the commitments in international law that it had made, not to engage in racism against the local population. And of course, in the West today, we think racism is like the worst thing imaginable, and Azerbaijan was adjudicated as having violated the International Anti-Racism Convention. And Azerbaijan's response was simply to ignore the judgment against it. Okay, now, if you're in a domestic situation and you win a judgment against another party, then you can go to the executive branch, which will enforce that judgment. The marshals will go in and impound property, or, assess a fine or whatever, or put people in prison. Well, how do you enforce an ICJ judgment? The enforcement mechanism is, and the ICJ judgment as a matter of law is binding. That's what every state does when it signs up for the ICJ. It commits to enforce ICJ judgments in cases against it. Well, if a state decides not to do that, if a state decides not to enforce not to abide by a judgment of the International Court of Justice, you go to the Security Council and you ask the Security Council to enforce the ICJ judgment. Now, Armenia, as far as I know, never did that with respect to this judgment it had achieved against Azerbaijan for violating the Racism Convention. And the reason, if I'm correct, the reason Armenia didn't go to the Security Council is it would have been totally useless, because there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council: Russia, United States, China, Britain, France, and others too. And it was inconceivable that the Security Council would have tried to force Azerbaijan to end this blockade. Probably Russia would have intervened, maybe even one of the other countries would have intervened and said, we need more time, let's not enforce this. So there was no effective enforcement mechanism there. So at the end of the day, as I say, if the great powers don't think that enforcing international law is in their interest, it will not be enforced. And I fear the lesson that we are taught by the Karabakh crisis is a fairly sad one. That and I think if I may speak to my fellow Armenians who are here, I know this is not an Armenian event, but Armenians should stop trying to look to international law to solve these problems, because it is simply not going to happen. There may be diplomacy, maybe something else, but I don't think, and there could be, I give other examples too, I don't want to take too much time, but I mean, ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity. And if you noticed, during the most recent events in September, the United States, including Samantha Power, who wrote a book about genocide, ethnic cleansing, who's now the USAID director, was asked point blank, is this ethnic cleansing? And she didn't want to answer, because by answering yes, then arguably the United States had some international law obligations. So they just evaded the question and closed their eyes to this. So I don't think that there's much help going to come from public international law in this situation. Armenians will have to look elsewhere, it seems to me, to try to settle this problem. And with that, I think I'll leave it to the moderator.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do just a little bit of follow-up before we get to the next round of questions, and just throw a couple of things back to our panelists to get a little feedback on. Artyom, Anna, Mark, in some ways you all touched upon the great power role here, either historically or in the given security moment or in the issue of international law. And I think, Anna, you sort of said the shifting alliances, right? That was particularly important for Armenia. And that does seem to have a very direct impact here in terms of particularly the role of Russia in the region. And I wonder if I could press you all just for a moment, given the current historical context. Where is there a great power role outside of Russia here? Is this something that the United States should engage more to project international law, project order? Is it someplace that is just proven to be too peripheral in the geopolitics of the West? It really exceeds the persistence of the conflict as well as the inability for sort of international order to find patch here has been a challenge. And so I guess I'd ask, is this just outside of that is it that great power region? You just have the local great power simply too unstable. And if you all want to respond historically or security or legally wise, just a couple of minutes. We can go in the same order, Artyom, if you want to start sort of the historical swing. You might be muted.
Sorry.
Yeah, happens to all of us.
Yeah. Well, the long and short of it is that the great powers can do something, but they haven't. And there is a number of reasons why they haven't. And I think I can briefly sort of elaborate on it. As the latest round of violence was happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then Azerbaijan effectively drove out the Armenians, 100,000 plus Armenians were driven out. And then one of the major Western news papers, The Guardian, had managed to get a hold of a senior European diplomat saying, should the EU be embarrassed by what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh? You have a peaceful 100,000 people driven out, and the EU barely, released a peep on what was happening. Well, an anonymous senior European diplomat, as The Guardian described it, was that, well, the whole geopolitics things played out there. Well, we know when we're talking about the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza, Israel, we're not talking about geopolitics, right? We're mostly concerned about the human rights violations. Russia has attacked these freedom-loving countries, destroying, and we have human rights obligations. And our consciences, which are completely pure and unadulterated, are imposing on us this will to go and help Ukraine. But when it comes to Armenia and Azerbaijan, well, the whole geopolitics thing played out, which gives me sort of an image in my mind. I'm from Minnesota. Our best known landmark is the Mall of America. So essentially what the EU is saying is that who cares if your little house on the prairie is burning when the entire Mall of America is on fire? Or who cares if your little house on the slope of Mount Vesuvius is burning when the entire Mount Vesuvius is erupting, right? So there is sort of an attention to the largeness of the conflict and how large it looms in Western geopolitical interests. And if these interests, as you say, are peripheral to these interests, it means that it was allowed to sort of play out. Peaceful lives be damned. Peaceful bloodshed be damned. Nobody's going to care about it. And it's a cold, brutal reality. And I think a lot of people, as Mark has alluded, have now come finally to realize. And I'm reminded the opening shot of The Godfather. If you remember, there's this wronged person whose daughter has been violated, who has come to Don Corleone to ask for his help, and says, I believe in America. I believe in justice. I believe in the law. And when my daughter was taken advantage, I went to the justice. But what happened to the people that had violated my daughter? They got suspended sentence. And that's why I came to Don Corleone, because I know you're going to settle the issue that the justice system can. I mean, it may sound cynical, it may sound rather pessimistic, but I cannot but echo Mark's sentiment that the international community, the international law, the enforcement mechanisms or lack thereof, the way it is, has been completely played a negative, an absolutely negative role on the Armenian predicament. So I'll finish with that and see where it goes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I mean, where do I start? Geopolitical tensions, geopolitical interests clearly have had an impact and have a massive role. There is no question about that. If I'm assuming this was not a yes and no question, Fred, right? So how that plays out. Okay, so for Russians, I mean, traditionally, the South Caucasus has been the Russian stronghold, right? We know that. And that has been challenged recently by not only the regional powers like Turkey, but also US and EU. I mean, essentially, yes, it was periphery, and the US and EU were not that desperate to push Russia, sort of or to push against the Russian interest in the South Caucasus. But I would argue that the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war actually changed that. So you have essentially, the US and the EU, as peripheral as it is to their interests, pushing the Russians in the region. We don't have to go into details, but there is an interesting dynamics that probably for the students would be important to keep an eye on. And what these interests are, I mean, we can unpack it if there is interest, but clearly they are at play. Now, how have they been playing out, right? After 2020, Russia obviously is still massively present in Armenia, particularly both formally and informally when it comes to its military presence, right? What is interesting is that, however, after September 2022, EU managed to send an unarmed monitoring mission. It's unarmed, it's a civilian mission, but it has its presence now, right? Even if it's symbolic, it's there. And that means that EU has sort of not only through the civilian mission, but also, by the way, through the mediation process that the EU has been leading. I think this is something that we might be interested, or the audience might be interested in knowing. So pushing geopolitical interests through mediation, that's an interesting phenomena that is picking up in the South Caucasus as well, right? And the US has been backing this, if not working together with the EU, but also having their own separate track of mediation. So essentially, after 2022, then you have EU presence on the ground. If you go to the south of Armenia, which is the tip with Iran, the southernmost tip of Armenia, that is the border with Iran, you will understand a lot more the geopolitical reality is changing than when we speak on the Zoom, right? So essentially in the heart of this part of Armenia, southern Armenia, Kapan, it's actually the town where I come from originally, you have now EU presence, you have Russian presence, and you have Iranian presence. So the Iranians actually have had a reaction, right, towards the EU and the West getting more interested in Armenia for their geopolitical interests, be it through civilian missions, be it through mediation, be it through economic support, what have you. So Iran has actually made an assertion as well, right? So when you go to Kapan, which is the biggest town in the south of Armenia, you will see these three flags. You'll see the EU flag, you'll see the Iranian flag, and you'll see the Russian flag. The Iranians and the Russians have opened their consulates in Kapan, a small town with 25,000 population, right? So, I mean, I don't have to go in there, and I dropped Iran into the conversation so that the audience can see that actually that it is periphery, but it's also not, right? When you think about shifting alliances, think about US interests when it comes to Iran, think about Israel and Iran, think about Israel, Azerbaijan and Iran, and a lot of the picture would become clear. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a fascinating dynamics. If it wouldn't impact people's lives, I think for scholars, it would be fascinating to study, but unfortunately, it is quite explosive. Now, two words very quickly when it comes to mediation, when it comes to the peace processes and how they have been used. And this is the first time I'm going public, actually, with this, saying this openly, but, I do bear responsibility for my statement. So EU and the US they might have done this unintentionally, but by providing alternative mediation platforms to the Azeris, they created more space, maneuvering space for Azerbaijan to actually strike a deal with Russia when it comes to dealing with Nagorno-Karabakh and stuff. So unintentionally, these mediation processes that might have been launched with the idea of under the narrative of guaranteeing peace and security in the region, they were actually driven by geopolitical interests. So, but that's a big of a statement. I think we can unpack that if there's interest. So my argument is that by providing the EU and the US, by providing alternative mediation processes to the Russian-led mediation process, they actually did harm. And for mediation to do harm, even if it's unintentional, it's a huge responsibility. And I think what my colleague said already about, I don't want to say the futility, but the limited impact or the limited use of international law, I think that has to be highlighted, because now we are back to the times where what I said in the beginning, might is right, and state interests take over and geopolitical interests have taken over. The whole liberal peace paradigm has been challenged massively.
Yep. I have nothing to add about any of that. That's not my area of expertise, and I will just defer to my colleagues on that.
Yeah, I think to follow what made me think in terms of your approach, Mark, as Artyom and I were talking, is the potential mobilizing effect of international law, right? That you can't mobilize states necessarily, even though you should be able to, right? But at times, violations of international law presented broadly to the public sparks a kind of indignation that creates pressure on states to act, on the EU or the US to become more involved, right? But interestingly, and as you pointed out, that may not necessarily always be to the benefit of the resolution of the conflict. But it does seem to be a point where you can generate tragically some public interest in the conflict. You say, look, these are clear violations of of international human rights law around things like ethnic cleansing, around things like discrimination. I feel like maybe it gives some leverage within at least the democratic powers to push forward some foreign policy. But I think to take it in the next direction, where we've got some questions from the chat, and I know there's real interest, is the interaction between religion and the conflict and the religious diversity in the region. And we've heard a little bit about the traditional Russian-Armenian alliance there, and the Azerbaijan has its own. I think Anna, you were starting to get towards its relationships with Iran and the idea of co-religious identities, but that do not necessarily get along particularly well here politically. So I'm curious if we can bring in some of the interreligious relations within the region, and potentially how it might be leveraged a little bit towards a resolution, or if there really is not something that provides us with some linkages here. We can start, Mark, I think you've got some background on religion and conflict and religion in law. So maybe you want to kick us off a little bit on this one?
Sure, I can start it off. So I think the role of religion in this conflict is a complicated one. So I don't think that it's correct to say this is a religious conflict in the sense of, metaphysical debates or, two contrasting religious commitments that are now incompatible and fighting each other the way we've had religious wars in the past. I don't think that is the case. I don't think that Azerbaijan and Azeris and Armenians are fighting about religion per se. But I also don't think it's correct to say that religion is totally irrelevant to this conflict. And I think the way to make it all make sense is that, we're used in the West, we sort of think more and more about religion as a matter of individual belief. a matter of, individual commitments. And that's one way of looking at religion. It's an important way. It's very affected by the Protestant background of America, especially. But another way of thinking about religion is as a marker of cultural identity. And I think in that sense, religion is very important in this conflict because the goal here, which has been the goal going back at least 100 years, the goal of Azerbaijan and Turkey is to unite the Turkic Muslim world. Now, there's some complications. The Azeris are mostly Shia Muslims and the Turks are mostly Sunni Muslims, but Azeris think of themselves as very much culturally Turkish. And a sizable Christian Armenian community right in the way of that is a serious problem. So, I'm sure that Azerbaijan and Turks would say, we're fine with Christians. We don't have a problem with, Christian churches more or less as museum pieces. There are very few Christians around. If a handful of people want to do this, that's not a problem for us. In fact, they may actually tout that to the West, and the West doesn't really understand too much what's going on. They say, that's great, right? I mean, I've had friends tell me, but aren't these, religiously tolerant societies? Well, the problem, though, is if you have a sizable number of Christians, 100,000, 200,000, 2 million, who really want to govern themselves as a unit, well, then that's a problem for the pan-Turkic Union. And in that sense, I think religion genuinely is a problem in this conflict. Now, that leads to another point, which is, well, okay, then how come the West is not more interested in this? Because the West, at least historically, has a Christian identity too. And, in the United States, for example, evangelical Christians, Catholic Christians get deeply involved in politics. And you can see it actually going on now in the conflict with Israel and Palestine. There are a number of Christians who are very exercised about this because they identify very strongly with Jews in Israel because of religious convictions. That has not really happened with Armenian Christians. Armenian Christians have not been able to get traction among Western Christians. You don't have a lot. You have some. There are some honorable exceptions, but for the most part, Western Christians have ignored this conflict in Armenia. They have not gotten involved, which is a pity, and I think there are reasons for this. I think that, I've said elsewhere, Mideast Christians like Armenians, there's a problem for them politically because they are too Mideast for the right, and they are too Christian for the left. And so nobody really is a supporter of these people. And so that has been a problem, which I'll finish with this comment, Fred. What you said before about, can't international law motivate people and shame people? Well, I don't think it has done a good job of that here. Certainly, the Azeris have not been shamed into doing something, largely because they're probably being told by European diplomats, well, we don't be ashamed. We really don't care about this very much in words or substance. And with respect to motivating numbers of Christians in America, that hasn't happened because there's not a sense of identity there. So the short of it is, I would say that it's not a religious conflict, but religion does play a role. And so far, that has not worked to the benefit of the Armenians.
Thank you. Do either of you want to follow up on that? Or we do have a question from the chat that I could sort of bring into the conversation. And that, Artyom, I want to sort of point this question from the chat towards you because I think you particularly did a nice job in your starting point presenting, I don't want to say an even historical approach, but the different aspects of it. And the question really focuses on presenting the writer put, the Armenians who've committed violence against Azeris while still advocating for the sovereignty and protection vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, right? The sense that there is blood spilt on both sides, and sort of balancing that as clear, but while still clearly advocating for a human rights agenda within Nagorno-Karabakh and the ability to maintain, if not or reclaim that presence, at least protect that culture. So it's sort of in that sense of how do you do both? How do you balance both sides? Which I think is a lesson that we need to take to lots of conflicts, but we can focus it here for the moment.
Well, it's difficult, and in certain episodes, Armenians, though by and large have been wronged in this conflict, Armenians do not necessarily in all of the conflict episodes come out smelling like a rose. It's a conflict, it's a war, and bad things do happen in war, right? No conflict is not uncomplicated unless you have clear victims and clear victimizers, like the case of the Armenian genocide, like the case of the Holocaust. You have an evil system that perpetrates evil that is beyond descriptions and so on and so forth. But when it comes to issues such as Armenian and Azerbaijani conflict, you have almost equal powers struggling, fighting over something that they consider their own. And in these things may not always be black and white. And I'm not comfortable being in a gray zone myself. And, you know, you try to explain to your students that gray zone is a comfortable place to be sometimes, but it's not necessarily reflecting the reality on the ground. Yes, I mean, during the conflict, Armenians did push back against Azerbaijanis, and one way to push back was to push back in violent ways. That is not, as an Armenian myself, I'm not proud of those episodes. I have always tried to speak out and condemn these episodes, and as much and insofar as they had happened. But at the same time, you have to understand where Armenians came from. It was a conflict that started as a peaceful demonstration by the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh and in the Armenian Republic. And Azerbaijan, through the manipulations of either Moscow's KGB or the local KGB or the dethroned formal head of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev's father, Heydar Aliyev, they blanched out against the Armenians. And the genie of violence was let out of its bottle. And you cannot unscramble a scrambled egg. You cannot put back the toothpaste back into the tube when things like this happen. The conflict, you know, there's a great Greek American, I think he's American, theoretician of violence. His name is Stathis Kalivas, and I highly suggest everyone to read Kalivas's book, The Logic of Violence in Civil War. When the logic of violence is let out, it takes on a trajectory of its own. It becomes subject only to its inner logic and nothing else. And that is what happened with the Armenian and Azerbaijani conflict. The conflict spiraled out of control. And the parties that could control it either looked askance or looked away, weren't willing to control it, to impose coast on Azerbaijan, to impose coast on Armenia, and so on and so forth. So they just tried to manage the conflict. And I try to be as even-handed as possible and as objective as possible. But at the same time, you have to realize where sort of, who sort of beat the apple first, if I may use another religious metaphor here. And it wasn't the Armenians, which is not to say, again, that Armenians are totally innocent victims of this or victims of circumstances. But again, conflict is conflict for a reason. We have words for it. And Armenians, of course, pushed back. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're coming towards the end of the time, so we want to just give you all a chance to leave us with what you most want to leave us with, so to speak. So, and Anna, if you want to take the lead on that, and as we just kind of wrap up just a couple of minutes.
Right. Sure. Happy to. I mean, I want to pick up actually on the last bit, right? Like what Artyom said about the gray zone and about the responsibility of all parties. I mean, being in the business of peace mediation, I think me of all the people knows what it means to be in the gray zone, right? To have this both sidism, what we have, and that's being challenged massively, right? So I mean, if I were to yes, I'm completely with you, Artyom. Very quickly, I don't want to get too personal, but when in 2014, when I was asked by the Swiss government to sort of do conflict analysis on Nagorno-Karabakh, for me it was a painful experience. I didn't want to do it. I'm Armenian. I don't want to do this, right? It took me 3 months and of serious professional work to realize, oh, oops, the Armenian side, we have actually incurred pain as well, right? So it was a massive shift in my head, and I'm being very open that to realize, yes, Artyom, you said 500,000. I think, the numbers, the UNHCR numbers say 800,000 people were actually displaced from the 7 regions around Nagorno-Karabakh. Of course, and I mean, the realization that, it goes both ways. As you said, it's a war and the violence erupts on both sides if there are 2 parties. But what I wanted to bring this conversation to is to the negotiation table, right? So what happened on the negotiation table? And if you look at it, and then not as an Armenian or as an Azeri, but as a professional, the usual narrative right now out there is that, okay, negotiations failed. That's why Azeris picked up the guns or whatever, the drones, Bayraktars, and decided to deal with the issue militarily. And I would argue, actually, not because negotiations failed that he was desperate, and by him I mean Aliyev regime, to resort to use of force, but the other way around. Azerbaijani side was never actually interested in a compromise solution. Right? Unlike the Armenian administrations, all at least 3 of them plus the recent one. So I would like to leave the audience with this one, that it actually, so yes, in conflict, both sides, violence, whatever the intentions, the reasoning behind the violence was. But then at the negotiation table, you could see that clearly on the Armenian side, there was willingness there was willingness and preparedness to compromise, while on the Azerbaijani side, over the 20 plus years, at least after the father Aliyev, right, was never any interest to deal with the issue in a peaceful way. So that's an important element. And that you can say as a professional, and it has nothing to do with my ethnic background. The facts talk about this. If one party is interested in taking over militarily, they will never make compromises. That's what I would like to live with. I mean, yes, over to you, Fred.
Okay. If we want to close on that, Artyom and Mark, if you're good, I know we're hitting 1 o'clock a little after. In some ways, I hate to close on that because it's a bit of a sad commentary, right? I mean, I think it's an extraordinarily difficult conflict, in part because I feel the persistence is one where there has been so much poor faith, like you say, at that level, and one where, just as an outsider, seeing students come through, it just has not been something that is on the radar of people. And so although it happens and it happens again, it is something that still needs to be brought to people's attention. So thank you guys all very much for your participation in this. I think it's a really tremendous opportunity for students to hear about this. And Megan, of course, thank you for getting us